Chapter 19. Nuclear Revolt. Mikhail Gorbachev first visited the Chernobyl nuclear plant on February the 23rd, 1989, almost 3 years after the catastrophe. He never explained why it had taken him so long. On his first and last visit to Chernobyl, the Soviet leader was accompanied by his wife, Raisa. The photos published in Soviet newspapers featured both of them dressed in white gowns, speaking to similarly dressed plant managers and a score of party and government officials in one of the reactor units of the troubled power plant. 3 of the 4 units of the plant were producing electricity in February 1989, but the problems caused by the explosion were far from over. In December 1988, the KGB reported to party officials in Kiev on a number of problems with Unit 4, the sarcophagus that covered it, and the decontamination efforts. Scientists and engineers were still unsure how much radioactive fuel remained in the damaged reactor and what state it was in. They could not investigate more closely for lack of equipment capable of withstanding radioactivity levels above 200 roentgens per hour. Civil and military crews worked around the clock removing contaminated soil and burying radioactive trucks and equipment. But here, too, appropriate equipment was unavailable, and much of the work was done with primitive machinery, endangering the health of the workers and soldiers present and slowing down the whole process. The bulldozers that were removing contaminated soil often mixed it with clean soil, further polluting the area and spreading radiation instead of containing it. Then there were continuing problems with the sarcophagus itself. The shelter over the damaged reactor was partially built on the sections of the old unit's walls that had survived the explosion. This had been considered a brilliant architectural solution because it could save the lives and the health of construction workers. But now it was seen to display all the hallmarks and drawbacks of the Soviet quick-fix approach. The foundations of the reactor unit, which were never designed to bear large loads, were slowly sinking into the ground under the weight of the new concrete structure above it. The pouring of concrete onto the approaches to the sarcophagus in order to suppress radiation from the soil, as well as the construction of the underground concrete wall that was supposed to prevent radionuclides from contaminating the groundwaters of the Dnieper River basin, changed flow of groundwater beneath Unit 4 and thus made the foundations of the sarcophagus less stable. Mikhail Gorbachev had little to offer the struggling power plant by way of new funds, as the Soviet economy was in freefall, accelerated by declining oil prices on world markets, the main source of hard currency earnings for the state budget. He placed his hopes for improving Soviet economic performance in market reforms. In May 1988, 9 months before coming to Chernobyl, he managed to obtain parliamentary approval of a law on cooperatives, collective enterprises in the industrial sector and the service industry that broke the state monopoly on economic activity in urban areas and allowed non-state ownership of small businesses. But those were marginal changes. Partial reforms failed to revive the economy, which had always suffered from shortages of foodstuffs and consumer goods, but now went into a tailspin, leaving the shelves of Soviet stores half empty. The behemoth of the Soviet economy was showing fewer and fewer signs of life. Inspired by a vision that dated back to the Prague Spring of 1968, when the Czech communists tried to create a communism with a human face, Gorbachev believed that economic reform was impossible without some form of democratization. What Gorbachev saw around him seemed to confirm his view that the two aspects of reform were interdependent. His Perestroika initiative undermined the state monopoly on ownership of property and thus the economic foundations of Soviet socialism. Consequently, it met with stiff resistance on the part of the old party and managerial cadres. Gorbachev responded by pushing political reform, challenging the party elite's power monopoly, and introducing elements of electoral democracy into the political system, which was still basically that of the Stalin era. With these measures, he hoped to outmaneuver his conservative opponents while mobilizing his liberal supporters. He gave the latter a degree of political freedom that was supposed to compensate for empty shelves and economic hardships. On February the 24th, 1989, the day after his visit to Chernobyl, Gorbachev met in Kiev with Ukrainian writers who were eager to launch the movement for perestroika, which was in preparation since the November 1988 Kiev rally. It would later become known as Ruch. They wanted to help him with his economic and political reforms and sought his help in return. Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, the party boss of Ukraine and a protege of the long-deceased Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, was present at the meeting. There was no love lost between Gorbachev and Shcherbitsky, who was one of the few conservatives remaining in the Politburo. The quarrel over the parade of May 1st, 1986 in Kiev, when Gorbachev had forced Shcherbitsky to conduct the mass rally despite rising levels of radioactivity, was only one of the many causes of the strained relations between them. Shcherbitsky had faith neither in Gorbachev's reforms nor in his management of them. Convinced that the new General Secretary was driving the country to ruin, he once remarked to his aides, "What idiot invented the word perestroika?" Shcherbitsky had used all the resources at his disposal, including party organizations and the KGB, to prevent the Ruch movement from forming. The Ukrainian writers placed their last hopes in Gorbachev's visit. Oles Honchar, Ukraine's most celebrated writer, pulled no punches when, in his presentation to Gorbachev, he called the Shcherbitsky orchestrated campaign against Ruch persecution. Gorbachev did not interrupt Honchar, allowing him to vent his frustration at the Ukrainian party boss. He pretended to know nothing about the predicament in which Ruch found itself. That, at least, was the impression that Ivan Drach, an anti-nuclear convert and a future Ruch chairman, took from the meeting, which he considered a success. Gorbachev wanted to hear our opinion. That is the approach of a real leader who does not rely only on outside assessments, Drach told one of his acquaintances, who turned out to be a KGB informant. We are now hopeful that the hounding of Ruch will stop. The KGB reported Drach's words back to Shcherbitsky. There is little doubt that after the meeting with Gorbachev, Shcherbitsky ordered the media to stop its campaign against Ruch. Although the resistance of the Ukrainian party apparatus to Ruch continued, its persecution of it subsided considerably after Gorbachev's visit, allowing the Ruch founders to begin preparations for their first Congress. That Congress met in September 1989. A few weeks before it began, Gorbachev forced Shcherbitsky to resign. A new era was about to begin in Ukraine, significantly affecting the fate of the Chernobyl nuclear plant and the exclusion zone around it. The Ruch leadership would take no prisoners in the war on the nuclear lobby and its supporters in Ukraine. On February 16, 1989, a few days before the writers' meeting with Gorbachev, the Ruch program had been published in Literaturna Ukraina, Literary Ukraine, the newspaper of the Writers' Union of Ukraine. The program included an extensive section on ecological issues, with special attention to the Chernobyl disaster and its consequences. The ecology section followed the section on social justice and preceded sections on the nationality question, culture and language, which were all important to the writers. The Ruch program called for the shutdown of the Chernobyl nuclear plant and of all other RBMK reactors in Ukraine. A halt to the construction of new nuclear power plants in Ukraine, no matter what reactor type they were designed to use, medical examinations for the entire population of Kiev and other regions adjacent to the Chernobyl power plant, and rehabilitation measures for those adversely affected by the disaster. The Ruch program was published in time for the first semi-free elections to take place in the Soviet Union since the revolution of 1917. In order to speed up reforms of the Soviet political system, Gorbachev had decided to create a new institution, the Congress of People's Deputies, a super-parliament of 2,250 representatives. 1/3 of the deputies would be appointed by the party, while 2/3 would be elected by the voters. The elections were scheduled for late March and early April 1989, with the Congress to begin work in May. The elections turned into a battle between the Communist Party appointees and the representatives of the new democratic movements, who treated ecological concerns as seriously as they did the political and economic problems that were besieging the rapidly declining Soviet system. Throughout the Soviet Union, the leaders of the now awakened civil society, distressed by economic hardship but encouraged by Gorbachev's political reforms, turned to eco-activism. It soon took on the features of eco-nationalism, a political movement whose leaders linked concerns about environmental protection with ethno-national agendas, presenting their republics as the principal victims of the centre's environmental policies. Nuclear power plants were depicted as embodiments of Moscow's eco-imperialism. In Lithuania, controversy centered on the Ignalina nuclear power plant, which ran on Chernobyl-type reactors. In September 1988, Sąjūdis, the Lithuanian Popular Front, which served as one of the models for the Ukrainian Ruch, mobilized close to 20,000 people to form a human ring of life around the Ignalina plant. The plant was perceived as not only an ecological but also a cultural threat to the Lithuanian nation. Like the Chernobyl plant, it was staffed largely by Russians and representatives of other non-indigenous peoples. In Armenia, a December 1988 earthquake triggered mass protests, leading to the closure of the Metsamor nuclear power plant, which was built in an area of high seismicity, only 36 kilometers from the capital of the republic, Yerevan. In Ukraine, Ruch was the largest of several new organizations demanding the closing of the Chernobyl power station and taking care of victims of the disaster. The Ukrainian writer and pioneering environmental activist Yuri Shcherbak, who was among the early supporters of Ruch, continued to lead his Green World Association. In April 1989, the association published its own program centered on Chernobyl-related issues. Shcherbak ran in his native Kiev for a seat in the Congress of People's Deputies. A scholar and writer who had never been a member of the Communist Party, he faced stiff competition from the party-backed candidates, who accused Shcherbak of being both a Ukrainian bourgeois nationalist and a Zionist. If that were not enough, they pointed out that his wife was Polish. But Shcherbak, who stuck to his ecological platform, was elected with 57% of the vote, a major accomplishment in a constituency with 6 candidates on the ballot. In late May 1989, when Yuri Shcherbak arrived in Moscow to attend the first session of the Congress of People's Deputies, he was by no means the only member of the newly created super parliament to put ecological concerns at the top of his agenda. Of the 2,250 deputies, about 40 represented environmental organizations of various kinds, while at least 300 included environmental issues in their programs. But there was one deputy who stood out in the small but active group of Greens in the first semi-freely elected Soviet parliament. Her name was Alla Yaroshnitska, spelled in Russian as Yaroshinskaya. A young journalist elected to the Congress from the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine, which lay in close proximity to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, she became the new face of the movement that demanded the whole truth about the Chernobyl disaster and its consequences. She ran on a program focused on the fate of one of the regions most affected by radiation fallout, the Narodichi district, located less than 80 kilometers west of the Chernobyl nuclear plant. It is imperative to make public the consequences of radioactive contamination in the Narodichi district, hitherto carefully concealed from the people, read Yaroshinskaya's electoral program. Once in Moscow, she made sure the entire Soviet Union heard about the tragedy of Narodichi and took notice of the long-term effects of the Chernobyl disaster. Yaroshinskaya was known as a rebel, a native of Zhytomyr, a city of some 250,000 people located 140 kilometers west of Kiev. She had earned a journalism degree from Kiev University in the early 1970s, when the KGB was destroying whatever liberal spirit still remained from Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign of the 1950s and early 1960s. She saw fellow students expelled from the university for placing flowers at the foot of the monument to the Ukrainian national poet, Taras Shevchenko, on the wrong day. It was fine to celebrate his memory in March, but not in May, as doing so in May was considered an expression of Ukrainian nationalism, which was to be suppressed. Then her husband was expelled from the university for writing a paper in which he praised the revolutionary-era anarchist leader Nestor Makhno, whom he called a hero of Ukraine. The Soviets considered him a dangerous counter-revolutionary warlord. Yaroshinskaya collected signatures under a letter protesting her husband's expulsion, but to no avail. A talented writer, Yaroshinskaya landed a job with the Zhytomyr regional newspaper, but refused to join the Communist Party and remained the only non-party reporter on the party-run paper. She was an idealistic believer in social justice and the overall soundness of the Soviet system, and she knew that she could not publish articles exposing deformations and abuses of the system. She thought it would be acceptable, however, to write personal letters to Moscow authorities, alerting them to abuses of power by local party bosses. Some of her letters were addressed to Leonid Brezhnev, the head of the party and of the Soviet state. One day she was summoned to the regional party headquarters and ordered to stop writing letters if she wanted to keep her job. She was also called into the KGB to discuss her political views, and on one occasion she was even abducted for a few hours. A KGB colonel drove her to the outskirts of the city as part of an attempt at intimidation. Yaroshinskaya was not cowed by those tactics. The election of Gorbachev as General Secretary of the party revived Yaroshinskaya's hopes of working for a better and more just society. In 1986, she and a fellow journalist, Yakov Zaiko, established a club called For Perestroika in Zhytomyr. The communist media accused them of trying to create a political party, a crime tantamount to high treason in the pre-perestroika USSR. There was no hope of publishing anything critical of corrupt local party officials in Zhytomyr's newspapers, so she tried more liberal media outlets in the capital. It worked. Glasnost had yet to reach Zhytomyr, but it was taking its first steps in Moscow. In June 1987, the second most important Soviet newspaper, Izvestia News, published an article by Yaroshinskaya attacking the Zhytomyr party bosses for their intolerance of criticism and persecution of opponents. The party bosses fought back, forwarding a letter to the Moscow Central Committee signed by 19 local reporters who attacked Yaroshinskaya. Her own newspaper called a party meeting at which the authorities grilled her for 6 long hours. She was demoted to a part-time position, but refused to abandon her efforts. In the fall of 1987, Yaroshinskaya, then 34 years old and a mother of 2, asked her male boss for a day off. He refused. She insisted and got her way, but only after she told him that she needed that day to have an abortion. Instead of going to a clinic, Yaroshinskaya drove to the small town of Narodichi, where in the office of a local official she studied a secret map of radioactive contamination in the region. She had become interested in the problem on hearing that the authorities had begun building new housing and facilities there for people resettled from the exclusion zone near Chernobyl. It seemed to Yaroshinskaya that the new location was still too close to the disaster site to be safe. When she asked her editor for permission to visit the new settlements, he had refused the request, telling her that it was none of their business. Theirs was a regional newspaper, while decisions on resettlement were made at the Republican and all-Union levels. It was up to Moscow and Kiev-based newspapers to look into the matter, but Yaroshinskaya would not take no for an answer. The first village in the Narodichi district that Yaroshinskaya visited in complete secrecy from her editor was called Rudnya Ososhnia. It was under constant radioactive monitoring. The local school was closed when radiation levels in the building exceeded 1.5 rem per hour, but the authorities kept their construction program going, expecting people to keep living there. The workers whom Yaroshinskaya met at the local construction site were tiring easily and developing headaches. They were paid supplements of 30 rubles per month, allegedly for better nutrition. The workers called it coffin money. Neither they nor the locals could tell her why a new kindergarten was being built in the radiation-affected village, where there were hardly any children. A new bathhouse was also going up, apparently to make it easier for the locals to cleanse themselves of radioactive dust. Yaroshinskaya was appalled. For the next month, she and her husband spent their weekends going from one contaminated village in the region to another. The situation was the same in all of them. There was new construction, and radiation levels were being kept secret, endangering the health of both the locals and the evacuees who were being resettled there from the exclusion zone. There was also a growing health crisis, particularly among children. Yaroshinskaya learned from local medical personnel that 80% of the children in the region had enlarged thyroid glands, a sign of abnormally high levels of radiation exposure. Before the Chernobyl disaster, only 10% of the children had had such symptoms. If Yaroshinskaya was to help the inhabitants of the region, she had to publicize their plight. Her own newspaper was not prepared to publish the results of her investigation, but she could always try Moscow, where her criticism of the local party elite had already appeared. But Chernobyl turned out to be a question too sensitive even for the central media. Izvestia, where she had published previously, turned her down, claiming that the topic was classified. The party's leading newspaper, Pravda, or Truth, did likewise after half a year of procrastination, saying that a similar article had already been approved for publication. Yaroshinskaya's appeals to Vladimir Gubarev, a Pravda reporter and author of numerous articles on Chernobyl, proved fruitless. The mouthpiece of perestroika, the journal Ogonek, Little Light, headed by the Ukrainian writer and poet Vitaly Korotych, whom Yaroshinskaya managed to meet in person, also passed on the article after numerous promises to publish it. So did another liberal newspaper, Literaturnaya Gazeta, literary newspaper. All these rejections were mainly due not to the wishes of the editors, but to the strict censorship imposed on anything related to Chernobyl, short of glorification of the efforts of the liquidators. Vitaly Karpenko, the editor of the popular newspaper Vechirny Kiev, Evening Kiev, later recalled having been reprimanded simply for publishing a photo of Kiev with very few people on the streets in one of his issues for May 1986. His case was examined by the secretary of the Ukrainian Central Committee. Anything the newspaper published on the matter had to be approved either by the Moscow authorities or by the secretary of the Kiev City Committee of the Communist Party. Later, Yaroshinskaya got a hold of secret resolutions adopted by party and government agencies, classifying anything dealing with Chernobyl. The KGB had taken the lead as early as May 1986, putting the stamp of secrecy on everything from the causes of the accident to its impact. In June, the Ministry of Health issued a directive classifying all information about the medical treatment of the population in contaminated areas and radiation levels sustained by the liquidators. In July, the Ministry of Defense ordered its human resources officers not to register service in the Chernobyl zone in the personal files of officers and soldiers dispatched there. There was to be no mention of radiation exposure in the files unless it reached 50 rem, 10 times the usual norm and twice the Chernobyl norm. Yaroshinskaya had hit the wall, or so it seemed at the time. There were limits to glasnost. Blaming local authorities for corruption and shortcomings was part of Gorbachev's attack on the Conservative Party apparatus. But telling the truth about the Chernobyl plant, for which the central government was responsible, was an entirely different matter. That would have required an admission of guilt on the part of the central authorities, including Gorbachev himself, for hiding the truth from the people and then spending tens of billions of rubles to rehabilitate the affected areas and inhabitants. Gorbachev simply did not have the money. The economy was in decline, with long-awaited reforms disrupting the existing system and putting an even greater strain on dwindling government coffers. Yaroshinskaya was reduced to distributing copies of her article to her friends. In the era of glasnost, she had no choice but to return to samizdat, the practice, perfected by Soviet dissidents of the previous era, of copying prohibited texts on private typewriters and circulating copies amongst friends and acquaintances. But then, suddenly, everything changed. At the 19th Communist Party conference, called by Gorbachev in the summer of 1988, to approve his plans for semi-free elections, the Ukrainian writer Boris Olenik broke the taboo on speaking publicly about the responsibility of the central authorities for the Chernobyl disaster. In September 1988, the liberal Moscow journal Novyi Mir, New World, published an article by the Belarusian writer Ales Adamovich titled "Word of Honor, It Won't Blow Up Again, a Non-Specialist's Opinion." Adamovich not only wrote about the responsibility of senior officials for the accident, but also argued that huge areas around the Chernobyl power plant were much more contaminated and dangerous to live in than had yet been admitted. The truth had been concealed, claimed Adamovich, so as not to endanger the construction of new power plants. In fact, he went on, the situation was catastrophic. For example, the Belarusian city of Bragin, 90 kilometers from Chernobyl, was considered too dangerous for medical doctors to be stationed there on a permanent basis. Accordingly, they worked in shifts, while the residents, including women and children, stayed permanently, wrote Adamovich. Adamovich's article pushed the envelope of glasnost further than Olenik's address, making the fate of contaminated areas a topic of legitimate discussion. In September 1988, the month in which Adamovich's article was published, Yuri Shcherbak brought a small group of filmmakers to Narodichi, the subject of Yaroshinskaya's utmost concern. The documentary film, produced with his help, showed calves born without eyes and with other deformations caused by huge radiation levels at local farms, in one case levels 150 times those of the city of Kiev. Over the course of the year after the accident, 64 deformed animals were born at that particular farm, compared to 3 during the previous 5-year period. But the 20-minute documentary would not be shown on television or the big screen, leading one of the filmmakers to publish an article describing his findings. The authorities were still doing their best to keep the truth under wraps, but their monopoly on information was crumbling. In the late summer of 1988, Yaroshinskaya was allowed for the first time to speak in front of large audiences about her findings in the Narodichi district. The response was enormous, and on the part of almost everyone except party officials, extremely positive. The citizens of Zhytomyr wanted to hear more and would prevail upon their bosses at factories and research institutes to make halls available for her presentations. By the time the elections to the Congress of People's Deputies came along in the spring of 1989, no hall was big enough to accommodate all those wishing to hear Yaroshinskaya speak. She was now addressing crowds in city squares and sports stadiums. Party officials tried to intimidate her with threatening phone calls and hate mail. They tried to pressure her husband, who served in a firefighters' unit of the Ministry of the Interior, to divorce her. They harassed her son and opened criminal investigations against dozens of her supporters, accusing them of planning an attack on Communist Party headquarters. Still, she gathered crowds, with the numbers of people coming to hear her reaching 20,000 to 30,000. Eventually, the authorities gave way. The local newspaper for which she had worked all those years, and which had turned against her under political pressure, found itself obliged to print her electoral program. She was elected with more than 90% support. In Moscow, Yaroshinskaya quickly established a bond with like-minded deputies. Among them was her fellow ecological activist Yuri Shcherbak, the author of an explosive documentary, Zapredel, Beyond All Norms, about the Narodichi district, Mikhailo Belikov, and the ecological activist Serhiy Konev, from Dniprodzerzhinsk, an industrial town known chiefly as the birthplace of Leonid Brezhnev, but later reviled as one of the most polluted cities in the Soviet Union. Once Mikhail Gorbachev opened the discussion at the Congress of People's Deputies, Yaroshinskaya and Chicherbak put themselves on the speakers list, hoping to get a chance to talk about the ecological consequences of the Chernobyl disaster, but neither Gorbachev nor any of the officials chairing sessions invited them to speak. Yaroshinskaya then took the initiative, approaching Gorbachev at the dais, to ask him to allow her to speak on the Chernobyl issue, and Gorbachev obliged. She used her 3 minutes at the podium to talk about the Narodichi district, the contaminated villages and the lies told by Ukrainian health officials, who had claimed that levels of radioactivity in the region had done no harm to those who continued to live there. She characterized the situation as scandalous and handed Gorbachev Belikov's documentary about Narodichi. The veil of official silence on the consequences of the disaster was slowly being lifted. After her presentation, Yaroshinskaya received dozens of telegrams and letters congratulating her on her courage. In the following days, other deputies raised their voices against the government's concealment of information on the issue. Among them was a medical doctor from the Mahilau region of Belarus. The party boss of Belarus, Yevgeny Sokolov, went to the podium to declare that 18% of Belarusian territory had been contaminated by the Chernobyl fallout. Yaroshinskaya was appalled that the most senior official in the Ukrainian delegation, Prime Minister Vitaly Masol, remained silent. But when she returned to her native Zhytomyr and held her first meeting with her electors at the packed city stadium, and later met with the people of Narodichi, she could tell them that things were changing. Before the end of summer, a government commission headed by the Soviet Deputy Prime Minister was already in Narodichi, accompanied by the deputy head of the Republican government and the party boss of the region. The KGB informed Ukraine's party boss, Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, about the session of the Academic Council on Radiobiology of the All-Union Academy of Sciences held in Narodichi. Close to 800 people had gathered at the Narodichi Cultural Center on June the 13th to meet with the scientists. Some members of the audience called for strikes to force the authorities to proceed from finally acknowledging the problem to doing something about it. But aside from reporting on such demands, there was little that the KGB could do. The political situation was changing. By the fall of 1989, not only Ukraine but also neighboring Belarus was in ecological revolt against the communist authorities. In Belarus, the first mass demonstration took place in the capital Minsk on September the 30th. Government officials tried to stop the buses that were bringing people from contaminated areas in the Homel and Mahilau regions to take part in the rally, but they failed. Close to 30,000 people listened to the leaders of the Belarusian Popular Front, an analogue of the Ukrainian Ruch, which had been created a few months earlier in virtual exile in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. No Belarusian party or state official addressed the people. The authorities were in denial, if not of the grim consequences of the Chernobyl disaster, then of the fact that they had lost their monopoly on information and political action. The elections to the Congress of People's Deputies and the work of the Congress helped lift the veil of secrecy over the ecological effects of the Chernobyl disaster, but they did little to bring the anti-nuclear activists closer to their ultimate goal of shutting down Chernobyl and other nuclear power plants using RBMK reactors. The activists got their chance, however, with the elections to the Republican parliaments that took place in early March 1990, the second stage of Gorbachev's political reform. This time there were no party-appointed deputies. Everyone who would occupy a seat in the new Republican parliaments had to be elected, and the results came as a major surprise to Gorbachev and the other officials in Moscow. The deputies to the All-Union Congress in the summer of 1989 had only been able to name and shame. The deputies to the Republican parliaments in the spring of 1990 turned from words to actions. The voters in a number of republics elected proponents of national independence, who associated it closely with the idea of denuclearization. But the degree of anti-nuclear zeal among the new deputies differed from one republic to another, depending on the distance it wanted to establish between itself and Moscow. Lithuania, the site of the Ignalina nuclear power plant, where mass rallies in support of shutting it down had been held in the fall of 1988, was the first republic to declare its independence from the Soviet Union. The declaration was made in March 1990, soon after the newly elected Republican Parliament met for its first session. Alarmed, Gorbachev responded with an economic blockade of the rebellious republic. The newly elected leadership of the Lithuanian Parliament now had to consider the importance of an energy source independent of Moscow. The economic blockade, coupled with a number of temporary shutdowns of two of the Ignalina plant's RBMK reactors, forced the leaders of the anti-nuclear movement to change course and start thinking not about shutting reactors, but building new ones to ensure their country's independence. Nuclear activism was turned on its head. In Ukraine, where the political elites were still far from seriously considering the possibility of separation from Moscow, but where the impact of the Chernobyl disaster had become an urgent issue, anti-nuclear activism not only survived the elections of 1990, but grew in strength. In February 1990, in the middle of the electoral campaign, and in an attempt to remove the Chernobyl issue from Ruch's political arsenal, the communist leadership of Ukraine orchestrated a decision of the outgoing communist-controlled parliament to shut down the Chernobyl power plant by 1995. The authorities also refused to register Green World as a separate party and prevented its members from running on a party platform. But these desperate moves to eliminate Chernobyl as a central political issue had little impact on the outcome of the elections. Among the most popular election slogans was a rhyme that blamed the Communist Party for the Chernobyl disaster and looked forward to seeing it expire at the nuclear plant. Chai żywy KPRS na Chernobylski AES. Long live the CPSU at the Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station. 3/4 of the leaflets produced in Ukraine during the electoral campaign included references to Chernobyl and ecology, which appeared to be more important to the electorate than questions of the economy and social justice. More than 100 deputies elected to Parliament, roughly 1/4 of the total, joined the pro-Ruch parliamentary caucus known as the People's Council, a stunning blow to the seemingly all-powerful party machine. In April 1990, the 4th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster was marked by rallies in towns and settlements near all the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. In the town of Netyshin, next to the Khmelnytsky nuclear power plant in western Ukraine, about 5,000 people rallied. In the city of Rivne, in the same region, some 3,000 demonstrated. They demanded the closure of the Khmelnytsky and the Rivne plants, which were located roughly 100 miles apart. The protesters, largely local, spoke Ukrainian and carried signs denouncing the party and attacking the mostly Russian and Russian-speaking personnel of the two power plants. They tried to break through the gates of the plant in Netyshin, but were stopped by guards. The Netyshin rally supported the workers of one of the local concrete-producing facilities, who had stopped supplying concrete for the construction of a new unit at the Khmelnytsky plant. Those workers called on other workers to join the strike. The KGB was alarmed and informed party officials in Kiev about the danger of mass unemployment in Netyshin if the authorities caved in to pressure and shut down the Khmelnytsky plant. The Ukrainian authorities sought a compromise. In the summer of 1990, the new parliament, continuing the trend started by its predecessor, which had decided to shut down Chernobyl, introduced a 5-year moratorium on the construction of new reactors on Ukrainian soil. The parliament also created a special commission to deal with problems related to the Chernobyl disaster, and to investigate the role of the Moscow and Kiev authorities in withholding information about the dangers presented by the explosion. The main goals of the ecological movement had been achieved. Ahead was the difficult task of finding and managing scarce resources to rehabilitate the people and territories affected by the disaster. But the political leaders of the mass movement that had been launched into political orbit by the Chernobyl-inspired anti-nuclear mobilization were now turning their attention elsewhere. In October 1990, Ruch held its second Congress in Kiev. The early ecological activist Ivan Drach, now a parliamentary deputy, was re-elected as its leader, but Ruch changed its program, dropping the words "for perestroika" from its name and declaring the independence of Ukraine as its principal goal. The ecological segment of the program underwent minimal change, but it was no longer ecology alone that was causing people to mobilize for mass action. With the political freedoms that had been won under the banner of eco-nationalism, the new political leaders could openly address the issue of gaining independence for their republic. The shock wave of Chernobyl was about to destroy the foundations of the Soviet Union.